back to the Ultraviolet Tide. Today we have another podcast episode for you with a fantastic guest. And today we're talking about the lies of productivity. Marissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're excited for this conversation because, as we were talking about before we started recording, this is something our audience knows all too well. They know the burnout, they know all of the things that you're going to talk about today. But before we really dive in and I hand the floor over to you, I'm going to give a brief introduction so that our audience can get to know you and your background a little bit more. So Marissa is a third-generation Lebanese American. She received her master's in public health from Emory University in 2015 and was an ORISE Fellow for the CDC from 2015 to 2017. She served as the assistant director and then the executive director of the UC Berkeley School of Public Health for 4 years, and in 2021, she launched McKool Coaching. McKool Coaching helps women in the public health sector really stop overworking and get more rest. And I know, Marissa, that is just the tip of the iceberg for all the work that you do. So can you tell us a little bit more about your background and then the mission of McKool Coaching?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So like Erica said, my background is in the public health field. Actually, I've done some work in social work as well. In the beginning of my career, I worked with children and adolescents with various behavioral and mental health diagnoses and their families and helping them get care and navigate that challenging system between school and the legal kind of field and medical treatment and all that. And then I went into public health, and most of my work has been focused on sexual violence prevention, as well as reproductive health care and maternal health in a variety of sectors: academia, government, nonprofit, doing evaluation, doing leadership. Like I've really ran the gamut. And in 2017, my mom became unexpectedly ill, and I made the choice to move home to take care of her. You know, there was really no one else. My parents are divorced, so I was only 28 at that time. And that meant she was in the hospital for ICU for about 6 weeks. I was her health advocate. I was dealing with insurance. I was also still working full time. My life was uprooted to live somewhere else. You know, there's so much happening. And I think when I look back on my journey, I wouldn't say that's the beginning of my burnout experience, because I think it was already on its way. For those of you who are listening who maybe work in helping professions or are familiar, those fields, we have low resources, high turnover. Everyone's in those fields because they want to make an impact and they care, not because of fame or money. So overworking and overwhelm is very common, but that life experience, that huge challenge of my mom getting sick and becoming her advocate and caregiver added so much weight to that. And I didn't have the tools to really navigate that in a way that would allow me to not burn out. So after she got better and I, got a new job at UC Berkeley, you just think, oh, everything's going to be better, right? That like life challenge has moved on. That's just not true. Just because that particular stressor is gone doesn't mean the stress you're experiencing is gone. And there was so much I had to learn about processing emotions, managing my stress, really making space to have time for myself. And that was such an amazing yet challenging journey for me to go through. And when the pandemic first hit, I looked around and a lot of my colleagues were struggling so much more than I was because our workload went up huge. And everyone in the world was freaked out about what's going to happen. But my experience of it was different. And the only difference I could see was I had these coaching tools. I had these mental, emotional tools to help me through it that came as a result of my burnout, advocating for my mom, overworking. And so I really just saw it was kind of a light bulb moment of, wow, this is maybe my next calling. The work I want to do is help other people learn how to stop overworking, stop feeling overwhelmed, manage their stress. Because I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to this. I have psoriasis, which, as many of you probably know, it's an autoimmune that can be triggered by stress. And every dermatologist, they're like, the best treatment is reduce your stress. And I say, well, how do I do that? They don't know how to answer that question. And, something like coaching, the tools that I provide around actually having tools to do that
Mm-hmm.
is really, really missing in the field, in like any discussion about burnout, overworking, and rest. Because a lot of it is focused on, okay, change external circumstances, quit your job,
Right.
move.
Right.
That's not feasible in a lot of circumstances, right? So, what do we do when we can't quit our job, when we don't want to move, when we have someone we're caring for, or we're ill ourselves? We need
Mm-hmm.
tools to actually help us through it rather than just the advice of like, avoid that stressor at all costs.
Right. I think that's so funny that you bring that up because I hear that all the time whenever you're experiencing some kind of health situations and they're like, oh, well, it's brought on by stress. So your job must be very stressful. And it's like, yes, but I can't change that. There are only so many things that are within my control to
Yes.
change.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be so frustrating of, okay, it's like telling someone like, oh, just be confident. Okay, well, what does that mean? How do I do that?
Right.
um, and so, I've gone through coaching. I've been gone through therapy. Now I'm a coach myself, and my approach is really about kind of giving those bite size, simple, easy, effective tools that you can do every single day. It doesn't Your stress, your burnout doesn't change overnight. Like, we're not
Mm-hmm.
about gaslighting anyone here. But the more you practice implementing some of the tools we'll probably talk a little bit about more, the more day-to-day changes you're going to see. And over time, it has such a cumulative impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, it's so important to note that just with how burnout is created and how you start to feel burnout, it also takes time to come out of that. And I think sometimes we expect this like quick fix because, well, we're doing all the right things. Why are we not seeing the impact? It should be happening right now. And that's such a great reminder for people that you got to be kind and patient with yourself because these things take time. And what I want to do, before we kind of dive into those tools is let's define, burnout and hustle culture and that grind lifestyle. Let's give a definition for kind of some of the things that might arise from that.
Yeah. So let's just start with burnout. I think there's not a universal definition. And the truth is, everyone's experience of burnout is completely different. So, following one specific definition might not work for some of you listening to determine if you're experiencing burnout. I think what's more helpful is to understand the different types of burnout. So, there can be physical burnout, there can be mental burnout, there can be emotional burnout, or you can have a combination of all three. Oftentimes, when we talk about burnout or we hear it in the news, we think of only the physical burnout, like someone goes to the ER because they passed out because they're so exhausted. That can definitely happen. But I find more often than not, it's the mental, emotional burnout that people are struggling with. And the book called Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski, I loved their definition. They talked about burnout as being stuck in an emotion. Whether it's, for me, when I was burnt out, afterwards I realized I was stuck in resentment. I was resenting that I had to be a caregiver, that, my job wasn't providing me the resources that I need, that leadership wasn't, helping me, that my siblings weren't helping me. I was stuck in that emotion, and being stuck in that place was burning me out. For other people, it might be overwhelm. It might be frustration. It might be dread.
Mhm.
And I think that's a place for those of you listening, you might want to check in with yourself. What is the emotion I feel most often? Is it one of those emotions? Am I stuck there? Am I able to move in and out of it? And that could potentially, I'm not saying definitely, it could potentially be an indicator that you are burnt out or heading towards it. I think the other thing to mention around hustle culture, because burnout has a couple, in my mind, contributors. There's definitely the external factors, which we are not denying. You know, being in a healthcare system that you have to pay for, that you have financial stress moving through, dealing with caregivers who they're understaffed, so they're stressed, right? We're not denying
Right.
those external things, but then there's the internal piece too. So in the culture, particularly in the US culture or quote unquote Western culture, we get a lot of messages that, what creates success and happiness is the more you do, how much you
Yeah.
get done, right? And it's not just in work, it's in parenting, it's in chores, it's in dating, it's in everything, that The more you get done, the more you're busy, the more you achieve, the more you accomplish, you should be successful. You should be happy. That's your value. That's your worth. And then
Mm-hmm.
on top of that, people socialize as women, which a lot of folks in the helping professions are, get messages from the patriarchy that their value and worth is determined by how much they do for others, whether it's in the
Right.
workplace, whether it's for family members, whether it's as a parent. And we internalize those messages, and they kind of become this little voice in our head that we don't recognize is driving us to really struggle with giving ourselves a break, with asking for help, with saying no, with setting boundaries. And so both those things impact and can create burnout, the external challenges, but also that internalization of that belief that you should always be doing, that doing more is always best. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what will prove your value and your worth and make you happy, which is absolutely not true.
That is one that, I mean, Snigdha, I know you're nodding your head as well. We went to college together, so that's where Snigdha and I met. And being busy was such a badge of honor. I mean, Snigdha, you had a
Yes.
very intense college experience because she was in a very, very uh, rigorous degree and major.
Yeah. And I think the thing that kind of contributed most to that was it was a smaller major at the time, and they're great people. Like, I learned a lot, obviously, and I still use everything that I learned in school today. But the major was small. There weren't many students, and in turn, they didn't get very much feedback, and they didn't know how to improve the program in the moment. And I think they've changed. It's like day and night if we were to look back. But I also think today hustle culture and checking off everything off your to-do list is so glorified. I mean,
Mhm.
I open TikTok or Instagram, and within 2 minutes of scrolling, I'm like, I can't do this anymore because some of these influencers, they and I feel like I always come back to this influencer example on the podcast, but I feel like we spend a lot of time scrolling these days, so I feel like we have to come back to that example. But influencers, they'll say like, oh, I woke up at 5 a.m. this morning, just took a little walk down the street to grab a coffee, and then I sat at the cafe and replied to all my emails for an hour. And then I went back upstairs and I did a 2.5 hour workout. And I'm like, when are you sleeping? When are you doing like actual work? When do you have time to relax? Do
Mhm.
you make yourself a meal? Like, or are you constantly, whether it's doing stuff for others, as you mentioned earlier, or doing stuff for yourself, I'm like, there's not enough time in the day to do everything that people share
Mhm.
online. But unfortunately, that's what gets views, and that's what also fuels their living. So it sucks, basically.
Yeah. And I think I call it like chasing the checklist. Like we have this
Mm-hmm.
belief once we get everything off our to do list, we'll just feel so relaxed and so good. But that never happens, partially because we often make a to do list that's twice as long than we have the capacity to do. But
Yep.
also, even if we were to finish the to do list, tomorrow there's going to be more. Like the
Yeah.
truth is, while we're living on this earth, we will always have things we need to do, whether it's making a meal, doing laundry, replying to emails. So the idea we've been sold that there's some point in which we get everything done and then we have nothing to do, that's just a lie that keeps us hustling versus the truth, which is there will always be things to do. So you need to choose when to slow down, when to take a break, when to take a rest. Rest doesn't come after those things because those things never end. Rest
Right.
happens while you're doing them in between. But that's another lie we've been sold about rest, that rest is a reward, that rest is earned, that it's deserved, that it comes after. That's absolutely not true. Rest is something that you need to learn how to implement throughout your day, throughout your week, as a part of your life, working towards whatever goals you have or healing or whatever it may be.
I think rest, and it's a good point that you brought up. I think rest, like you said, is seen as like a reward, but it is such a necessity to be able to continue performing at the level that you should be performing at.
Yeah. And when we think about it, humans, our physiology was designed to have rest to function optimally. And there's
Mhm.
different forms of rest. Like we just think of sleeping in or vacation. But again, I like to break it up as there's physical rest, mental rest, emotional rest, and then the physiological rest you might not even have any control over that's happening. And our brains, our bodies were designed for that rest to happen in those capacities so we could continue to move forward and evolve as a human species. But in hustle culture, we're kind of taught that no, you have to earn your rest by doing enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't work. That's part of the reason we burn out. And if you try to get rest that way, often what happens is when you finally, quote unquote, earn your rest, it doesn't feel good. You're like, wait, this is supposed to feel amazing and so relaxing, but I'm still stressed out. I'm still thinking about everything I need to get done. Of course, because that's not the way rest is really designed. It's supposed to be an integrated part of your life, not just like, the dessert you get once every other week.
Mm-hmm. I love this. And I know there are so many things you're saying that Snigdha's probably thinking about me as you're saying it, because I am a huge checklist person, because we run a business and there are so many things that have to get done on a daily basis. And when I went full time for OUV a couple months ago, I was having the hardest time giving myself a break, because I was like, I'm taking the ultimate risk right now. If I am not working and getting stuff done, then I'm not using my time wisely. Or, all of these lies that you tell yourself that just really hinder you. But it's such a hard thing if you are someone who is constantly wanting to achieve.
Yeah, and I'm definitely a checklist person too. And I think about this a lot, because when we think about the way we write our checklist, or if you like calendar your work, we never calendar rest or time for ourselves. We don't put that on our checklist. It's just assume that comes after, like you get the leftovers. And if you start to alter the way you do your checklist or scheduling, where you include things for you, rest, breaks, I actually schedule my week first starting off with my breaks, with my rest, with what I want to do for me, because that protects the time. Of course, is it a little like, then it's another thing you have to fill in? Of course. But, what's that option versus, oh, I'll just give it to myself as the leftovers, but there's never anything left over.
Right.
And I think there's this piece, understanding where some of these messages come from. During the industrialized revolution, the world, especially in the US and other places, switched from kind of having home economic base where, folks are largely farming or doing trading out of their home, making goods out of their home, to factories, to cities, where there were people at the top making a lot of money and then having their laborers work for very little money based on the amount of time they work, right? The saying, time is money. But there's many issues with that, which we don't have to get into, but in modern day, we still apply that thought process. When in reality, if you are rested, your brain is much more able to critically think, to be creative, to problem solve. So you might not need as much time to have high quality work. Versus if you think time creates your outcomes, then you're just working overtime. You're reducing your capacity to think clearly, to be creative, to problem solve. And actually you're making your work more inefficient. It's backwards, but it takes a while to like undo these beliefs and start implementing them in a way that serves us, because there's so much history to why we have the hustle culture that we have now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like almost rewiring your brain and things that
Exactly.
everyone is still telling you. But so you're talking a lot about rest. So let's talk about some tangible tools that people can implement if they are experiencing, they're listening, they're like, oh yes, I'm experiencing burnout. What are some tools that they can implement?
Okay, so I wrote down 3 that I want to share just to start with, where folks can start where they're at. The first one I think is so important is around learning how to process your emotions. Because when you are in burnout, or when you're in a high stress circumstance, whether you're going through treatment or you have financial stressors, what's happening is not only is your body going into the physiological stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze, but you're also having emotions about that, whether it's overwhelm, whether it's anxiety, whether it's guilt. And most of us are not taught how to process emotions. So what happens, the visual I like to use, just to give folks something to think about of how this works, is imagine you have like a cylinder tank in your chest. You don't, but just like imagine it for the metaphor purposes. And that's where your emotions are stored. Right now, for so many folks, that is full of that resentment or guilt or anxiety. and you don't know how to release some of the pressure. So there's like cracks happening on the edge of the cylinder and it's kind of overflowing. But if you knew how to process the emotions and let some of them flow out, then the cylinder would have space for those emotions to flow a little bit and to allow other emotions in. Because no matter how challenging your circumstances right now, how many stresses are in your life, there still are moments of calm and peace and joy available to you. You have to create the space to let them in. So processing emotions as a tool, it sounds so simple and inconsequential, but so important. And things like meditation or yoga or other breath work teach this, but it's really about taking a moment, can take a few seconds to stop and close your eyes, not while you're driving, and notice the physical sensations in your body, because all an emotion is a physical sensation in your body. Maybe it's like a tight knot in your stomach or fast beating heart or sweaty hands or a clenched throat or jaw. That's what an emotion is. And our bodies are designed to have emotions. This is a normal part of our being. If you stop and you breathe and you name what's happening in your body, you will be so shocked at how much this reduces the intensity. And then if you're able to take a step further and name what that emotion is, okay, I'm noticing I'm having a fast beating heart rate and sweaty hands. I'm feeling anxiety. Not trying to change it or push it away, just acknowledge it and give a little space. The more you practice that, the more you're able to process through your emotions and not get stuck on them.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the first piece. And then there's two other more like mindset-based tools I want to share. One is, for most of us, we focus all of our mental energy on things outside of our control, on people we can't change, on policies that are frustrating us, on the news, on, whatever it may be. And when you do that, you're using so much mental energy where there's no outcome you're able to change in that moment. Versus if you shift your mental focus to what is in my control, where do I have power? Where do I have choice? That gives you so much more momentum to feel empowered, to feel confident, to feel a little bit more in control, because there's so much out of our control in life. And related to that, I think one of the most, and I still say this, but one of the most unhelpful thoughts most of us say is, I have to. I have to take the kids to school. I have to respond to these emails. I have to make, $100,000 this year or whatever it may be. The truth is, everything we do is a choice. Everything. People every day don't pay their taxes, don't make lunch for their kids, don't eat their veggies. I'm not saying you should do any of these. I'm just pointing out that as adults, as humans, we have free will, meaning everything we do is a choice. When you tell yourself, I have to, that creates dread and resistance. When you tell yourself, I'm choosing to, then you get empowerment. You can choose something different if you want. Sometimes we avoid saying that because we don't want the responsibility. But the truth is, we have choice in everything we choose to do. That's where we have the most control, is over ourselves, not over these external things that we have very little control over. So those are the kind of the three tools I'd share with everyone to start with.
I love that you mentioned the I have to mindset and really kind of debunking that, because that's something that I've heard our community say time and time again, like, I have to go to another skin check or I have to do that. And I think what I'm starting to notice people doing is like, I have the community and the providers who are allowing me to like go get preventative health care, or, making the time and like just seeing it from a place of gratitude, where people have biopsies. It's like, it's not, I have to have a biopsy. It's like my provider understands me and I have the opportunity to try and catch cancer before it progresses. And I think that there's so much power in that, because that doesn't change the fact that it sucks. It still sucks, but mentally you're in a much stronger place and you're like, all right, whatever happens, I'll deal with it because I had the opportunity to get preventative health care or to treat this. And I live in a system that allows me to have access to it.
Yeah. And I think so much of what adds to our stress is that we focus so much on what we can't control. So we feel like our life is happening to us. But when you decide to believe I'm choosing to and focusing on where you have choice, you get to get back in the driver's seat. And you have to do that consciously, because when you understand how the brain has evolved, right? our brain has a negativity bias. It has a survival focus. It wants to look for all the negatives. It's freaked out by uncertainty because, for our survival brain, that gets in the way of evolution, right? So we have to intentionally bring our brain back to I'm choosing to and seeing where you have control, because our brains, the way that they're designed for keeping us alive, don't naturally go there all the time. Now, if you're in a real stress like life or death, your brain's going to take over and make that choice for you. And, it will go into that the way it's supposed to. But a lot of times in modern life, some of the things we're reacting to, like, you get an email and you feel like really stressed by it. That email itself might not be a physical threat, but your brain is responding that way. But if you can come back to, I have a choice, what's in my control, what do I want to decide, then that helps you reduce your stress response so much and feel more empowered to really take charge of the areas in your life where you have the opportunity, where you can.
When you bring up negativity bias, that's the same thing as like when people, they get coffee in the morning and someone pays for their coffee and they feel so positive, but then someone slams the door in their face and their day is just so focused on getting the door slammed in their face that they forget about the coffee. Is that kind of the same thing?
So negativity bias, and I'm so glad you asked so I can explain. Think about like thousands of years ago when the majority of the people of the world were in like hunter-gatherer groups. And there still are communities around the world who are in those groups, but our survival was dependent on not eating a poisonous berry, not accidentally walking into a community that we weren't a part of that might think we're attacking them. And so our brain built this mechanism to keep alert to what could kill us, essentially. And obviously there are still things we need to be aware of as far as our ability to stay alive. But it's not the same as when we lived as hunter-gatherers, where everything was a threat, where all day, every day, we were trying to just, keep alive. But our brain still has that negativity bias. So oftentimes our brain is always looking for either the negative or like seeing things and then interpreting them as a threat, and spikes our stress response. So for example, my partner, I really don't like the way he drives. We've never gotten in an accident. He's never gotten in an accident. But every time I'm in the car with him, my brain freaks out.
Yeah.
I'm not in danger in that moment, but my brain is responding in that way. That's part of the negativity bias. I think what you're speaking to adds to that, though, in our modern culture around the compare and despair piece of like, we see, especially what you were saying, Snigdha, the social media of like the perfect life and what everyone should be doing. But then real life sucks half the time. It's really hard half the time. And so we tend to kind of hyper focus on the hard parts and the negative parts because we have this ideal it should be good. We should get to a place where we're happy all the time, where everything's great. And if we're not there yet, we're a failure. But the truth is life is 50-50. Half the time it's going to suck and half the time there's going to be good things about it. That's just the truth of human life.
I think that's so important to remember. And, to bring back kind of to your coaching, you really focus on public health and care providers. And a lot of the people listening, they're experiencing and listening to this as patients. So what is, one thing that people can keep in mind as they're listening if they're experiencing maybe their providers are being overworked or places are understaffed? What's a good thing for them to keep in mind as they're maybe experiencing some of those things as a patient that are a little less than ideal?
Yeah. And I think a lot of times with folks who are patients, part of the challenge is it feels like there's so much you can't do. There's a power dynamic we can't deny that our healthcare system has created. Not just for like, okay, if they're understaffed, but we know that, women of color, Black women are treated very differently in the healthcare space than white women, just as one example. And we have to acknowledge that there are those power dynamics, that hierarchy in play. There are, bias. And then there are the stressors of low funding, high turnover, doctors working and not getting their own rest. So for folks who are patients who are in those circumstances, I think often what happens is we start to feel like we don't have any power, that we have no control. There's nothing we can do. We're at the whim of our insurance, of our doctor, of the hospital. And that's not true. You might not have power over certain things. You might not have control over certain things, but there are still spaces where you have power to use your voice to advocate for yourself, or to say no, or to change providers, or to request something. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, right? There might be work around that. It might be stressful, but there's so much value in just recognizing I do have some power here. There are some things I can choose to do, even in the situation. You don't have to choose them, but just recognizing where you do, rather than just feeling like I have no control. Like, you do have some control in some places. We have to kind of keep reminding ourselves of that, especially in those circumstances where power dynamics and hierarchy have been created by white supremacy, the patriarchy, hustle culture.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that we always hear our community reminding each other of is that if you are not happy with the kind of care you're receiving, you can switch providers. And that is something that people always feel so guilty doing, but that is totally within your power. If you're not happy with the care you're receiving, you can change it, and that's okay.
Yeah. And it is something, it's really important that we do remind each other of that, because some of the messages we get is that because we're the patient, we don't have any knowledge, right? That if the test says something or the doctor says something, that might be right, even though I know my body, I know this doesn't feel right. We get these like direct and indirect subtle messages that tell us that we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the expertise. We should always, always give authority to someone else. But that's not true, right? That's just an outcome of the way that our society has built around hierarchy of types of knowledge, of degrees, of, whatever it may be. So being able to have community and remind yourself, like, no, you know yourself, you have knowledge, you have skills, you have the ability to advocate for yourself. And doctors and providers are wrong. Like, that does happen, right? So it doesn't mean that anything's wrong with you for wanting to change providers because they're not listening, or because, they're saying nothing's wrong, but in your heart, like, I really think something's wrong. Like, that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was a story I heard at a conference a couple months ago for the Melanoma Research Alliance, and there was a patient forum, and one of the patients told the story of, well, during COVID was really when he was experiencing everything, and he had to have someone else in the room because as the doctor was talking about his diagnosis, his brain would just go blank. You can't always really process those things when they're happening to you. And he was like, I need my wife in the room. And the doctor said, I'm so sorry, due to COVID, you can't. And he's like, can we go out to the parking lot? Have you ever had, a patient, whatever in the parking lot? And the doctor's like, you know what? I haven't before, but like, let's do it. And that's such a strong example of like being an advocate for yourself and asking for what you need. And who knows, maybe you'll have a doctor's appointment out in a parking lot.
Yeah, I love that. And so I think that comes from believing you have power, that you can figure it out, that you can advocate for yourself, to even just ask that question, to problem solve, to think of creative solutions. When you don't believe you have that power or ability, or you shouldn't, that shuts down all of that creative thinking, all of that asking and finding different solutions and avenues. So I think that's a really great example. And, I think a lot of times there are obviously people very trained in healthcare who have great knowledge, but there's so much we don't know about the human body and the mind. But we know about ourselves. We've lived in our bodies our whole life. So for me, for example, with my psoriasis, the treatment I kept going through was not working. And they just wanted me to keep going. And as this is not working. Something's off. And I just stopped. And after, 6 months, my psoriasis went away.
Wow.
Now, was it the treatment causing problems? Is it my stress management coaching that actually has been helping? I don't know. But what I knew was my body and listening to my body and what I wanted to try for me. And other people might have different opinions. The doctor might have different opinions. Your mother-in-law might have different opinions. Your colleague might have different opinions. But I think, especially if you're socialized as a woman, we're taught so often not to listen to ourselves, that we don't have the authority, that we have to listen to other people. We can't trust ourselves. We should keep ourselves small. And that's part of this work too, is really building the confidence to listen to ourselves and trust ourselves and have our own back, because there's always going to be people who don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is incredible. And Marissa, thank you so much for, coming in and sharing your wisdom and for your time. And for everyone listening who want to connect with you, where can they find you if they want to listen to your podcast or find you on Instagram?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So my podcast is called Redefining Rest. Whether or not you work in public health, I think it will be really useful. Actually, this morning on LinkedIn, I was messaging someone who's taking care of her elderly parent, doesn't work in public health, and I shared the podcast because it really can help anyone. There's episodes on how to process your emotions, on these tools and more that I've shared, no matter where you're at or what you're struggling with. So that's available on any platform. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn if you're on there. Marissa McKool. I chat with folks all day. So you send me a message. I'm happy to kind of give you support and some coaching there. Or Instagram, Public Health Coach. I try really hard to share a realistic view of what creating a rest-centered life looks like, which means I cry sometimes. I don't get everything done. Sometimes I get stuck in shame. And it's not about putting this perfect picture out there. And so I try really hard to create that space because, as we've talked about, it's not really available in that many spaces in social media. So come hang out with me. I'd love to meet all of you.
Yep. And we'll link all of that in the show notes so people can easily find you and connect. But Marissa, thank you so much again.
Thanks so much for having me.